Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. We are having this afternoon the third panel of the symposium on Godard. The festival is doing a complete retrospective of Godard. We've been screening his features and his shorts from the 4th of November, and we'll still have some films that are going to be screened today and tomorrow. We have here with us to speak about Godard and the importance he has in film history and the influence he has in not only in filmmakers but also in different arts. Godard is one of the most influential directors in most of the art that is being made today. Not only the art but also the literature, even design or publicity, etc. On my left I have Miguel Marias, film critic and historian. He has written several books on many filmmakers, and he has written for the catalog of the festival a text on Godard. And we have Alex Rossberry, American filmmaker and screenwriter and actor. Thank you for being here with us. I might start with Alex. So you could tell us how a young filmmaker as you sees today the films by Godard that started in 1959-60 with that film that was a great that had a strong it was one thing that struck what was French cinema, and not only French cinema, the film Abu the Souffle. You have to, the green one.
Yes. I was going to say, because there's so few people, I would advocate that we just kind of all participate in a conversation together.
Yeah, that's the
rather
idea.
Than us pretending that we have, a lot to say, and we could just kind of open it up and talk about different things, and everyone can kind of just converse, and people can sit up here, and we can just kind of talk if people were interested in that, rather than listening to just two people talk to four people, which doesn't necessarily make the most sense. So if people were into a more kind of conversation, then we could maybe try that. If not, that's fine too. But to answer your question, you're talking about where my discoveries of the movies came from?
Yeah.
Well, it's important to think about that when I was getting very into discovering film and catching up on all the classics, there was only a small section of Godard films that were available on, at that time, VHS largely, or very few on DVD, especially from anything beyond the 60s was very hard to see, which meant that once you'd sort of watched the 9 or 10 essential features from 60 to 68, there was really nothing left to find, and you had to track down the 70s and 80s films, and the 90s ones weren't available at all, really. So even though he was a major artist, and that first decade was full of nothing but influential masterpieces, everything after that had a sort of mystery about it, and a very curious quality that when you would finally see some other movie, it always felt like you couldn't understand why it wasn't something that you'd already seen, because 10 of the movies were available everywhere and very well known and very widely seen, and then another 30 movies were incredibly difficult to track down, and some of them still are. And I think that is a huge part of what makes going through the filmography kind of an exploratory journey, is that some of them kind of required 10 years ago and still do a little bit of a treasure hunt, which is why it's a great opportunity at the retrospective to see some of these rarer titles.
Miguel Marias, you have followed this so Godard's work since the beginning.
Almost almost the beginning, really, because I'm much older than Alex, so I caught up with Godard, I think, sooner. Not precisely just after he made Abu de Soufre, but rather several years after. I think the first Godard movie I ever saw was Alphaville in '65, and then Pierrot le Fou, which is of the same year, then Vive sa vie, and then Abu de Soufre finally, because in Spain most of his films were banned or were not interesting for distribution. So they arrived belatedly. But then, just then I began to go to Paris, and I caught, for example, the premiere of Des Autrichoises que j'ai d'elle, the Made in USA, some others, La Chinoise, etc. So I try to see everything as soon as they come, because I was passionately Godardian since the beginning. And I must say I have remained Godardian ever since, because a lot of people of my age liked especially Abu de Soufre, but I think that the people who only like Abu de Soufre really don't like at all Godard. And then like the first period, the Anna Karina period more or less, and stopped liking Godard around '68, when he made, even before, when he made La Chinoise, Weekend, etc. There is the difficult period of his Maoist movies, and then we begin to the period that we should be covering in this part of the symposium, which starts in 1975, when he more or less returns to the cinema about after a specifically political period, and restarts his careers. I think that's really not with the first of the period, but especially with Sauf qui peut la vie, which is a film that restarts his career in some sense for some people. Others have never returned to be interested in Godard. So it's really complex, and I think that the period we are covering now is a very different and complex period. For once, he returned to a great activity. This period is 16 years, and it has 23 pieces of work, of which some are shorts, but some are very long television series, and some are normal features. So it's a lot of movies, and these lot of movies are quite different the one from the other. I don't think there is much relationships between Numéro 2, for example, and the final one in the period, Nouvelle Vague. And I think you could have A là pour moi also in this period, because I think it's very much related to Nouvelle Vague. But it's also a period where he discovers and begins to use videotape, which is an essential change in all his perception, and also beginning in '69 especially, when he begins to play with the projection and shooting speed of the movies. And he begins to disconnect, disintegrate movement and gestures in a way that one could say that until then Godard had been rather a Bassinian filmmaker, and then becomes a not at all Bassinian filmmaker. So there is a very strong change in his way of using the tools of cinema. And I don't want to speak all the time.
And it's also in the presence of, and it's the time he starts to work more often with Anne-Marie Miéville.
Yeah, there is a tendency, which I think has some justification, of dividing the long careers of filmmakers in several periods. It's very difficult to fix where are the borders between one and another. But in the case of Godard, you could say there is Anna Karina period, an Anne Wiathemsky period, and then an Anne-Marie Mieville period. It's curious that the three women in his life are called Anne. That's one of these strange connections. I've been always mystified also about Buñuel, which has a film which is called Susana, another which is Viridiana, and another one which is Tristana. Three names, rather strange names, including the name of Anna in them. I don't know if there is some secret there, but well, so that's the kind of thing. And I think it is important, especially one of these films, which it has been shown the other day, and I don't know if it's going to be repeated, which is called Soft and Hard, which is a dialogue between Anne-Marie Mieville and Godard, with both on screen. And I think that's the most intimate film that Godard has ever made. It is shot in their home near the Lac Le Mans in Switzerland. And they are both shown playing around and talking in their home. And it's a strange kind of home movie, but it's a very strange kind of home movie because they are not playing with kids or dogs, but they are rather speaking about the problems of the cinema in general. And I think it's a very interesting thing, and that the importance, the influence of Anne-Marie Mieville, which is also a filmmaker and a very interesting filmmaker, is quite important in his career. Probably of these three women, it has been the one most influential in the cinema of Godard, at least from my point of view.
But do you consider that Godard films have become more brain, a thing from the brain, and before they were more kind of romantic,
well,
if we can...
People usually tend to think that the films of Godard are very intellectual and very brainy and so on. But I really think that the unity between all the periods in his career, for me, is the emotion. I think that he plays with emotion, even when he uses distancing devices, a bit inspired in Brecht distanciation programs. And he cuts, when it's very clear when in his use of music, he uses a bit of music, he stops it, and then it starts again, and it has a kind of, this stop and go has a kind of emotional impact, which is very great. And I think that Godard is also one of the filmmakers which has a good ear with music, and which uses music in a very different way than most filmmakers use music for stressing something or supplying the emotions that are not on the screen, on the acting or on the story. And I think that for me his movies are always very, very moving. Even, for example, Le Gai Savoir is a film that it can be extremely abstract and so on. I find the interplay between Jean-Pierre Léaud and Juliette Berthaud is very moving, and also the use of colors, which is also very emotional, always in Godard, is also very active. There is one thing that you asked Alex, and worried me some days ago. In the Spanish paper El País, there was a kind of inquest. They are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the paper, and made an inquest among, I think, 16 or 18 Spanish filmmakers, young Spanish filmmakers, asking them which had been the directors which had most influenced them. No one of them mentioned Godard. Of 18 or so. I was completely shaken, and most of them were speaking of rather strange for me.
But don't you think that the Godard had such an influence on other filmmakers that they are being influenced without knowing? As the same as it happened in Portugal with the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa. If you ask young poets, maybe they don't say Fernando Pessoa has influenced them, but he has certainly influenced them through the reading of other poets that came after. Don't you think it's the same with Godard?
Not even direct influence, but second-hand influence, perhaps. Yes, it can happen, but I think that now people tend even to ignore where that comes from. So it's strange. It seems he has lasted a lot of time. He is the last living example of the new wave, of the French new wave, and he continues to be, for me, at the avant-garde, which is not what you would have said of most of his colleagues of the early avant-garde. But I always wonder if that is because he continues to be quite alive, or only because most of the cinema has gone back towards the past. The mainstream cinema certainly has gone back, and it's less and less venturesome than it was in the 60s or the 70s. So,
Alex, would you like to say anything about this?
Well, I have I've struggled tremendously to find any way to connect to, 50% of his movies made from the 70s onward. I find a good amount of them to be shockingly moving and using all of these experiments and tools in a really good way, and then some of them are so far removed from what I think the expectations are for when you sit down in a theater to watch a movie, that for me, I've sat there watching, I'll go see a screening of a film. I remember this happened, his film, I think, 1990-ish, JLG. Mm-hmm. It's not made to be watched, almost. It's made to be dissected and analyzed and thought about. And oftentimes the result is that you're seeing a movie in a theater with people, and at the end of it, everyone kind of admits that they had a really bad time watching it because it doesn't engage with anything such as characters or scenarios that you traditionally expect when the lights go down and a movie begins in a movie theater. And instead, it's occasionally in some of these films just kind of an assault of images and music and voiceover and editing without anything else that makes movies movies. And I've always struggled to find ways to find the emotion in some of these later, more obtuse works. And oftentimes just don't find it. I find it, and then you'll see the next one, and it's nothing but, some of the films you mentioned, Numero does nothing, just purely an emotional experience with characters that are vivid and filmmaking that is innovative. And then the next one, I don't know chronologically, but you could just then see another movie, and there's just nothing for you to feel connected to if you don't fully appreciate only the craft and the tools of how this movie was made. Like you're saying, the video exploration is very fun and the editing becomes very non-traditional, and the use of music was, the only, first of its kind in many ways. If that doesn't connect with you, then you're not connecting with the film being projected. And I've struggled in a fun way sometimes with a lot of the later works in that way. And I think that's why people that you say sort of give up or they don't continue to feel connected to the films.
Yeah, there is a curious thing with that. I must say, I think many of his movies are not really made to be shown in a theater with an audience, rather to be screened at home on a TV set with a DVD or a videotape, and are almost for individual consumption. A bit like the movies were in the early times of the Nickelodeon and so on, that people went into a gallery and looked at small film. The difference, I think there is a strong difference between the first period, let's say the Ana Karina period, and this second or third period. For me also, that the first movies I thought I understood directly. People went out of the theater when Pierre Rolifou was first shown, saying, I have not understood anything. And for me it was quite clear. It was exactly like my nightmares, including the colors. And then it happened to me around the time of rather the 80s than the 70s, that his movies, the first time I saw them, I had the impression, I think this is very interesting, but I don't quite understand it completely, wholly. And then when I saw it again, I began to understand it. So it needs an effort on the part of the watcher, of the spectator, to fully understand these movies. I think that's part of the difficulty with Godard. He has becoming more and more difficult with time.
Do you think it's like James Joyce in literature?
I wouldn't say, because I like the first novels of Joyce, and I don't like much neither Ulysses nor Finnegan's Wake. But, well, it happens sometimes. People get more complicated with age and time, and especially I think Godard always tries to do something he has never done, and usually that nobody else does. So as long as he works and works and works, and he has made really a lot of pictures, it becomes more difficult to trod a territory that he hasn't trod before and that other people had not anchored with. So it becomes more and more strange. To say the truth, the only film by Godard I don't like much is his last,
Adieu Langage,
which seems to me a contradiction with Puissance de la Parole and other movies he has always made. And I imagine, well, if he said Adieu Langage, really, he would be dead. So I don't think, and also there is another thing which I find very interesting regarding that movie. There is a small one in a film called 3D or something like that, which is the Troisième Desastre. And this is a short piece which for me says everything that Adieu Langage says, but
I agree with
very
you.
few minutes, and even the best shots in Adieu Langage are already in the shot.
Yeah.
So something a bit strange, and I think it's somehow a problem he has always said he had, that he had a difficulty in reaching the length that is usually demanded for the production of standard pictures. And he has always made rather films shorter than 90 minutes, which is strange in the period where most of the films usually last 2 hours or even 2 hours and a quarter or something like that. And I think he has become more and more compact, if the word is correct, in his way of saying things, which is also makes them more difficult. When his films, which are more narrative, even if the narrative is quite slight, like Les Mépris or Bonaparte or even Les Carabiniers, are more easily to follow, not to understand, but to follow and to watch. It's more close to the usual experience of going to the movies than his later movies. Especially, I think, the period, not even this one, but the last period, the films which he has made since the 1990s. But I continue to find him usually very interesting, even if I had said the one I like less, which is Adieu Langage. I have seen it 7 times, so anyhow, I find enough interesting things there to watch it several times, both in 3D and in 2D. I prefer the 2D version, curiously. But I think he continues to experiment. I'm a bit worried because someone told me the other day that he's now making another film in 3D.
And is it in 3D?
And some other thing which complicated things yet more. I imagine he will end up, if he lives enough, doing something in virtual reality or something like that. Because he never stops trying to use new things.
But as Chris Marker has already
yes, but
did.
Marker already died.
I think we can open up to the audience.
Okay, well, I guess I have one immediate question or response, I guess. As with Alex, I think I would agree that some of those films from the 90s are quite alienating. Maybe it's a generational thing, or what it is, but I think about this quite a lot. And it's interesting that you've come back as a dual langage being, for you, the weakest film. Because for me, when I saw it, I was very fascinated about it being a return to techniques of seduction, I guess, formal seduction. It's a much more visceral film, maybe, than some of the more, what we might refer to as cerebral films that were made over the 20 years previously, perhaps. And I'd be interested to hear you on. I also went to see Soft and Hard and enjoyed it very much and agreed that it's really fascinating. Within there's one key scene when Anne-Marie is talking to Jean-Luc and she's complaining that he can't really write romantic dialogue, right? This is the premise. And she essentially turns to him and says, "You're like a child who plays with building blocks." And he turns back and basically says, "And for you, cinema is all in your head." And it's kind of interesting because I guess the period we're talking about definitely marks Godard moving towards a more cerebral approach to image making. And I would suggest that maybe a dual langage is starting to go back to something more physical. And I just wondered, I guess, if you could comment on that. And also, Alec, what you think of a dual langage, if you've seen it within this constellation of Godard's push and pull with an audience, kind of inviting them in and pushing them away.
Yeah, well, I have seen it, and 2 things. One, you mentioned, I think, what I argued about with that film with many people, just sort of in the spirited debates that were happening when it was in release. Because there's images in that movie that are so horrible and so unthought out, just a camcorder pointing at a stream, which is so rudimentary and unexciting to see as an image in a film. And all I could say was, how can this image be in the 50th film by one of the most important artists of all time? And people were saying, well, they say he's beyond images. This is not a movie and this is not a career at this point that is concerned with the idea that any moment in a movie requires a well-composed and exciting visual image. because the sum of the 70 minutes of that movie is about so much more than the fact that 40 seconds of it is a shot of babbling water that I could get in that pond right there, right now with my phone, and it would look exactly the same. And I just felt like when you have somebody who is inarguably one of the top 10 most important filmmakers of all time, and they are working still voluntarily on their own personal projects that have presumably very little financial requirements of what the film end up being, I really felt like you would want to see that person do something, A, that they've never done before, and yet in both that film and the one before it, Film Socialisme, you just still have this music cutting in and out for the 30th year in a row, and you still have these cuts to title cards for the 30th year in a row, and it's just very peculiar to think about why these things that I was very excited by when I saw them in a movie from 1969, 15 years ago, are in a movie now by the same filmmaker, and people react to it in the same way. And I have a really good time trying to figure out what it is in those films that people respond to, because I don't really love either of the last two, although I like Goodbye to Language a good deal more than Film Socialisme, just because of the 3D of it. It's just kind of, that buys you a lot of credit in what he's doing differently, but the quality of the images in that movie is so poor to me. I just can't believe that someone who has seen as much as he's seen around the world and of cinema and of life can pick up a camera and create images that look so ugly, and that's maybe the point. But that goes into the other thing you said, that's something that I'm certain is the case, is that you mentioned something about lasting impact or younger generations connecting, and I'm fairly convinced, as with many works of art or bodies of art that are not entirely, but for one specific period, for one period at least, entirely connected to a political ideology. I'm certain that no one can understand the ideological importance of those late 60s, early 70s films in the way that you said that when you first saw them. You said this felt like a nightmare and it made perfect sense to you. And when I first saw the Mao films, British Sounds, Winds from the East, it makes no sense to me. I do not have the understanding, from not having been alive or politically aware at that time, to comprehend what those movies are even attempting to do, because now they function more as a time capsule of radical Maoist beliefs or what have you from a time period that is so far in the past now that people will not, I'm certain will not be able to love those films. And I'm certain that people of my generation and the next generation to discover his work will only be able to look at those films as curiosities and artifacts. And if you can watch a film that doesn't work for you on any level, but you know that it's an interesting piece of work, then people will still engage with them. But if people require something that actually speaks to them, I'm positive that almost an entire decade of his filmography will be indecipherable to people, because it's always eluded me, because my awareness of the exact nature of politics, especially in France at that time, is only something I can learn about third or fourth hand, and it makes those films incredibly difficult to actually put in my brain alongside the way that some of the other films, even the ones later from the 80s, really do actually mean a lot to me as cinema. And I'm very curious what the next 10 years will do for the sort of, if you picture his filmography as a continuum, you know that this one first decade is just going to get higher and higher as it becomes more and more entrenched in cinema history, and as you have, in the case of myself or people my age, the fourth generation of filmmakers to just cite those films as incredibly influential. And then I think the other periods will dip down, and then now the 80s stuff is kind of coming back up, and it's rising in influence again as it gets re-released and rediscovered. But I think to me that continuum is the whole point. The whole point is that you can have a 50-year career that has peaks and valleys, but then taken as a whole, it means something entirely different.
Well, I think one of the things that happened with Godard he has been always a kind of witness to the time he was living, and he had very good antennas. In some cases, he was seeing things that were happening before they were happening. It's the thing that has been a lot of times repeated when he made La Chinoise. I was in Paris in April '67, and then again in April '68, and what you saw in La Chinoise was already there. And there was the Langlois affair with manifestations and so on, demonstrations and so on, and it was exactly the beginning of what then happened in May '68. So then I had 20 years in May '68, so I'm almost simultaneous with that, and I have a knowledge of that period which allows me to understand them directly. But what always happens with something that is much of its time passes, and perspective changes. And now, for example, I saw again, after a long time, here, Pravda, which is a film he made in Czechoslovakia in '68. And I found it really terrible, in the worst sense of the word terrible, completely cheap and completely antipathetic, and even saying things against Vera Chitilova and Milos Forman, which was at that period almost a way of denouncing them to the Soviet authorities. I disliked the movie very much. I had never liked it, that one, but I disliked it very much. One must have in mind also that his political period, for me, is a very depressing thing. That I think Godard has always been a thinker on his own, and that period he became, instead of someone who thinks and says what he thinks, someone who repeats slogans which are in circulation and fashionable at the moment, repeating things from the pro-Chinese papers in France and things like that. And then you can have in them a series of slogans that you now listen to them and say, wow, what rubbish. So I'm very much for Godard, but not for all his periods, even if in these periods there are interesting investigations, uses of material and so on. But I think he has learned from all these periods, and even from his errors. I think that errors are part of man's activity, and one must make one's own mistakes. So instead of saying, no, don't say that, well, let them do what is a mistake for you, and then learn from that. And I think that he became then, around 75, he became, came anew for the experimenting with cinema, instead of having a kind of anti-cinema stance in the 60s, 80s, early 70s. And that even before that, I think that Toute Bavian is already a film which is stronger and more nuanced than this one before. But I think there is also a problem of connection with him. I can understand that people, my sons, for example, which are 25 to 35 years younger than I am, probably won't understand Godard movies at all. So it can happen. It can happen. I am younger than Godard is, but I'm nearer to that generation. So it's almost also a problem which you can see them always speaking about the history of cinema. People who are older probably will understand better films by older filmmakers and less the films of very young filmmakers. And people who are younger probably will understand better the new movies being made today than I will. So.
Further questions? But this way he has he has been kind of a researcher. That's something that comes almost from the beginning, because at the same time he has been in a film like Masculine, Feminine. It's kind of at the same time he shows us the youth of those days, or in deux ou trois choses que j'essaie d'elle, of a certain behavior of some middle class women in Paris, and so on and so on.
I think which is more curious is that if you see it with a perspective now, already in Vis-a-Vis and the Carabiniers, which are from 62 and 63 respectively, there is a nugget of what he made after May 68 and all the further movies up to now. So there was a bit of what he was going to experiment all his career, almost, because it's on films from the beginning of his career. And he has been exploring different areas and with some tools, and then changes to another tools, and then he explores a part of his work which I find very interesting, which is not narrative films, not fiction films, not neither documentary films, but films which are essays. And these films which are essays and which must sum up something like 1/3 of his work, so they are quantitatively very important, for me are also very important in quality, and also because this is a genre that has not been much practiced in the cinema history, which had in France also one of the great filmmakers of film essays, which was Chris Marker, and which I'm afraid when Godard dies, or Godard ceases making movies, that this genre will completely disappear, because it's probably the less commercial genre in the world. And they are really difficult movies that made you think and debate with the movies. I find very stimulating always. I don't need to agree with Godard's movies, but they usually say or ask questions that I find very challenging and very interesting, and one has to think about them and finally say, well, I agree or do not agree or hardly agree, but make you think. And I think one of the uses of cinema is to make you think better. So I think that's one of the things that I appreciate a lot about Godard, and which I think he began to make as a great film critic and has continued to make as a filmmaker through his work career.
Well, any further question?
Influenced by him, for instance, one or several?
Well, I think a lot.
But that we can immediately see, for instance, because I think all this very interesting, but I really don't understand very well, as you said.
The problem, I think, is that Truffaut said once that people take from Godard the shortcuts between the shots, without dialogues and so on, but they don't copy from him the despair. And I think that's true. Most of the things that have been influenced by Godard have been the superficial things, making a pan from one side to the other, filming people taken by the back, that kind of things that can be copied. It's a bit like it happens also with Buñuel. People copy crucifix in the hand of someone, or something of his jokes with someone who walks with an egg on his head, kind of thing like that, but not the real depth in him. And most of the filmmakers against whom the new wave was against in the late 50s copied also from Godard and Truffaut and Demy and Barda and René several of the aesthetic innovations, which in many cases were not really real innovations, were making again something which the cinema had done and which had abandoned them. For example, people were shocked, I recall it perfectly, as something quite new in Jules et Jim by Truffaut, with the iris plans, the shots made with the iris. That's in Griffith and a lot of early silent pictures, but of course the cinema had abandoned doing that. A bit of that happens also with Citizen Kane, which also made a lot of things that had been made in the early silent movies, or the very early beginning of the sound movies, and which were not already in use in 1941. And people said, oh, that's new, that's new. Well, it's not really new, but it looks new because you have forgotten. Well, with Godard that has happened also that kind of thing. Some superficial things were copied by a lot of filmmakers, and also I think he influenced people rather by daring to make things that usually people do not dare. He said at the beginning of his career, in one of his early interviews, that you really can put anything inside your film, which is a very dangerous statement, because of course you can put also a lot of rubbish into a film if you can put everything. But it also gives you permission to do anything that occurs to you, that you happen to imagine, that you would like, etc. And that is something I think it was taken as an example, but the new films that new filmmakers who surged in the early 60s, and which usually, I must say, had rather short careers or broken careers. For example, there has been a cycle also in this festival of the work of Jerzy Skolimowski, a Polish filmmaker whose first films were absolutely splendid, magnificent, I think very influenced by the early Godard movies. And then he had to leave Poland because of censorship problems and so on. Then he interrupted his career, and then he has made 4 or 5 years ago a kind of comeback. But this kind of things, that feeling at liberty to make things that usually were not made, I think it's the biggest influence of Godard. And also another thing, I think until the new wave, all the movies were told in the third person. A filmmaker never was speaking about himself and was not speaking about himself in first person of the pronouns. And with the Nouvelle Vague, they began to do that, especially Godard. Godard, one thing you can say, all his career, you can almost never see him, but in almost all his movies you can hear his voice, and in almost all of them you can see his handwriting, because he writes all the time, sometimes with hand and then last years with computers, but he's always met there. And I think it's crucial, even when they made in '68 political short movies which were anonymous. Those which were made by René and Marker were called film tracts. And those who Godard made were called cine tracts. And they were written with his handwriting, so everybody could have instantly said the author of that movie is Godard and put him in jail, even. But he cannot remedy that. He puts his imprint everywhere, which is not a thing to imitate, I must say. I think it's a character of his, which is interesting. And I think in that way it is very interesting because you now have lots of filmmakers, especially very young filmmakers, who speak about themselves, their girlfriends, their love stories, their parents, about themselves. They are more and more autobiographical movies. So I think that's perhaps one of the main influences. Other things have influenced a bit some filmmakers during several years and then not, and that kind of things. It's quite complex, the idea of influences, and also there is another thing which one must have in account. Some people influence you without your will. And for me, it's very telling what Chabrol told once. He said, I always had hated a shot in Citizen Kane when a parrot starts flying. But in his second or third movie, he copied that shot without realizing. And when he saw the film already in the editing script, in the editing room, he discovered, well, I had copied that shot. I always hated. Why? It happens.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that's a good way to end our conversation here. We'll be here again tomorrow in the morning at 11, from 11 to 13, with Álvaro Roba, the American writer Luc Sante, and the Portuguese filmmaker and Professor João Mário Grilo. And I hope that tomorrow Cyril Neira, that would be here with us today, can come. Thank you all. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Miguel. Have a nice day.
Thank you.